All right, as we get started here looking at the executive branch, the pictures you've been looking at are typical pictures of the White House, the front and the rear, and some of the interior pictures. And you can search online for more of those interior pictures. They're quite fascinating to see. Some of the more specialized rooms, the movie theater and the swimming pool and so on. We're going to talk here about the qualifications first. These are some of the basic pieces of information that you need to remember when it comes to the executive branch. First and foremost, just like the members of the House and the Senate, there is an age requirement for being president, and that is 35 years old. Residency, again, sort of similar to the House and the Senate in that in the House and the Senate you have to live in the state you represent. In this case, because you're representing the entire United States, the qualification is that you have to be a resident of this country for at least 14 years. Now, this sort of implies something, and that is, well, you didn't have to live here the whole time. Well, not exactly. So let's move on to citizenship here, and I'll come back to the idea of residency. Citizenship, the requirement for president is that you are a natural-born citizen. Now, what that means is that you are born in this country or you are born to American parents. Well, if you're born to American parents, they don't necessarily need to be here. Let's say that they're living on a military base in Germany, and you're born there, so you're an American citizen, born to American parents. And then you live there for a time, and you come back here, and then you go back there. You have to have lived in this country for at least 14 years. That's residency before you can run for president. Now let's talk briefly about removal by impeachment. We're not going to talk about the process here, but more so about the reasons. And that is, when it comes to a point that the members of the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate feel that the president has done something that qualifies for impeachment, what's important to realize is the Constitution specifies what those qualifications are. So, for example, in the Constitution it says that the president can be removed from office based upon conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes or misdemeanors. Now, what that means literally is this. Treason, obviously, a very serious crime. Crime against your own country. Bribery is basically accepting money for political favors. High crimes, those are things like murder, obviously. At the same time, the Constitution says very explicitly, or misdemeanors, which are very minor crimes, things that very often people don't even go to jail for. The idea is that it doesn't really matter what the crime is. If you are considered the law enforcer of the United States, if your job is to enforce and to execute the laws of this country, you have absolutely no business committing crimes in any sense, in any way, at any time. And if you do, those are grounds for impeachment. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily you're going to be removed from office. It is a two-step process. But it does mean that you can be accused of having committed a crime. Now, let's talk about the presidential term, because the fact is that the president's term is not something that is so simple as the 4 and 8 rule. There are some other things that are going on here that need to be considered. So, for example, if a president is elected in his first term is going to be 4 years long. If he's reelected, then he can serve for a total of 8 years. There have been many presidents who've served for 8 years. Some that have only served for 4 years. There is this kind of strange thing that occurs that is possible when a president dies that could result in a person serving, that is the vice president stepping in and serving for a total of 10 years. And that works in this way. Let's say that in year 0 a president is elected, and 4 years later, that's the mark when he would have to get reelected. Well, let's say that president dies. This is the 2-year mark here. Let's say that president dies right here, just after 2 years in his first term. The result is that at that point, the vice president takes over. And the remainder of this term does not count as a term for the vice president because it happened after the 2-year mark. What that means is that vice president then can run for election for the first time here, in a real sense, serve 4 years, run for election again in a second term here, serve for 4 more years. And so with this 4 years and this 4 years and essentially 2 years, although maybe not exactly 2 years, you end up with a total of 10 years. It's never happened, but it is written in the Constitution in this way so that we understand that there is a protocol. Now, obviously, if the president dies just before that 2-year mark, well, then this length of time here is considered a term for the vice president, and he would not be allowed to run for this second term. We would end up with something closer to about 6 years for a total term for that president. Now, what if the president does die? What happens then? Well, the president dies. We've already said that the vice president takes over, and that's a pretty simple process. By the way, if the vice president does take over, the question is, well, then who becomes vice president? Well, the vice president, when he becomes president, will turn around and nominate or select another vice president who then has to be approved by the U.S. Senate before he becomes vice president. If they both die at the same time, let's say that they're having lunch, for instance. Bomb goes off, both of them are dead. What happens then? Well, if they both die at the same time, the Speaker of the House becomes President of the United States. You can see then why being Speaker of the House is a very, very powerful position. At the same time, what if all 3 of them die? What if the president, the vice president, and the Speaker of the House are out golfing? Something happens, lightning strikes, all 3 of them are dead. Then what? Well, at that point, then the president pro tem of the Senate takes over, and he becomes or she becomes President of the United States. What if they all 4 die? Okay, we're getting ridiculous here, but understand the Constitution really tries to take into account all the possibilities, just so we don't end up in a situation where we don't have a leader. We don't have someone who represents the country. So if they all 4 die, then what happens is that we begin to look into and use the members of the president's cabinet. The president's advisors become then the focal point. And when the president's advisors are looked at for the purposes of becoming president, those advisors are considered in a very specific way. We don't look at the people, we look at the offices. So we look at the offices of Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, etc. And what we do is we try and focus on those people that are in the offices that were created at the earliest time. So, for instance, if you happen to be Secretary of State, you're going to be selected before anybody else because that is the oldest office created during George Washington's term as president. And then, for instance, if you are Secretary of the Treasury, you be selected second. So if the Secretary of State was not eligible to be president, well, then they'd skip right over you and go on to the Secretary of Treasury. And so on and so forth, based upon the order in which their offices were created by the Congress years ago. So who is this presidential cabinet? Well, they are the president's advisors, as I said. They are the heads of the departments that are under the president's control. And typically they have the title of secretary. Now, it's not a secretary like you and I understand secretary. A secretary in this sense is a person who is the head of an executive department. Now, what does that mean? Well, the president's job, remember, is to enforce laws. That's his primary responsibility. In order to do that, he's got to have an awful lot of people that are going to assist him in making sure that those laws are accurately and effectively enforced. So those different groups of people are going to fall into different categories or different departments. And so each of those departments then has a responsibility to carry out the responsibilities of the president, to assist the president, basically. In every one of these executive departments, the Secretary of Defense, for instance, is in charge of the Defense Department, and the entire military and all the Pentagon falls into the hands of the Defense Department. So this person who is the Secretary of Defense is in charge of an awful lot of people and an awful lot of information. But the president ultimately is in charge of, or is the manager of, or the boss of, the Secretary of Defense. The first 3 cabinet positions that were actually created were the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of War, and the Secretary of State. The thing is that those three cabinet positions aren't the same today. And the reason is because the Secretary of War has been changed to Secretary of Defense. When they recreated that office shortly after World War II, the Secretary of War dropped down on the list to about number 9 or 10 in terms of being eligible to be president if people were to die. And that's because the office had to be uncreated, Secretary of War, and then recreated as Secretary of Defense, therefore getting a new date and having a new sort of position in the lineup to become President of the United States. What the president does can be divided into two basic areas: powers versus duties. Powers are things the president can do. In other words, it's a choice that he can make. I can do this or I don't have to do this, but it's up to me as a president to decide what I'm going to do. Those are powers. Where the duties are things that he is constitutionally obligated or required to do. So there's a list here of presidential powers, and these powers are, they're rather specific. This certainly isn't a comprehensive list, but it is a list that is going to pretty well cover the powers of the president. So first of all, the president can cancel or veto a bill that's passed by Congress, basically effectively making something that was going to be a law not a law. He can agree to treaties. Now, when he agrees to treaties, there's a requirement. You cannot simply, as president, decide treaties all by yourself. Instead, they have to be approved by the Senate with a 2/3 vote. He can grant reprieves and pardons for those convicted of crimes. So essentially, the president has the power to do something that nobody else in the country has the power to do, and that is to basically forgive someone who is a criminal, to let them out of jail, to prevent them from being executed, whatever it might be. And of course, the president doesn't do that very easily. It's something that takes a lot of consideration, because the last thing you want to do is be accused as a president of someone who is soft on crime, being the law enforcer, and then letting people out of jail that go on to hurt other people. He can appoint ambassadors to foreign countries. He also can appoint, of course, members of his cabinet and judges to any federal court, including the Supreme Court. All of these require, of course, the approval of the Senate with a simple majority vote. So he doesn't get, again, to appoint people just because he feels like it. This is something that has to be approved by the U.S. Senate with a simple majority vote. He can also call special sessions of Congress. Now, this is a rather unique power. It doesn't happen very often. Usually in national emergencies, the president will demand that all the members of the House and all the members of the Senate assemble in one room, usually in the House of Representatives, where there's enough space to do this. And the president wants to speak to them. The president may give them a very direct sort of command. Now, it's not a command that he can actually enforce, but it may be a very strong statement of, this is what I want you to do. Why? This thing has happened to our country, and it's important that it gets done. So probably the two of the most notable situations where a special session's been called was, of course, when Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese, and the president called a special session, got the House together and the Senate together to talk about what had happened and to ask for a declaration of war. And probably the second most important one, or significant one in my lifetime, would be on 9/11, when President Bush gathered together the House and the Senate to talk about what they knew about 9/11, what had happened, and what they were going to do about it. Now, presidential duties, again, are things that he's required to do. And the first and foremost important duty that he has is to see that all federal laws are effectively enforced. And this is not an option. You can't pick and choose which laws. It doesn't say here he can effectively enforce some of the laws or choose the laws he's going to enforce. It says all laws are effectively enforced. He's also the leader of his political party. He's the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. That means he's basically the head general. At the same time, he's not a general that is appointed. He's one that is elected, so he's more responsive and responsible to the people of the United States than a typical military person is. He's also expected to meet with visiting dignitaries or leaders from other countries and to sit down with them and basically to have a nice, smile, shake hands, and chatting session, welcoming them to the country. Sometimes, obviously, those meetings go a little bit longer than just simply sitting down and shaking hands. Every year he's required to give a State of the Union message to Congress. And this is something that usually happens towards the end of January, It's rather an unusual kind of situation because in this situation, we not only invite all the members of the House and the Senate into the House chambers, we invite all the members of the Supreme Court into the House chambers. We invite all of the President's cabinet into the House chambers. And they're all sitting there in the same room listening to the President give this speech, this address. Now the thing is that we're having this meeting. Obviously, this is a point where we could have a great deal of damage done to our country. If a bomb were to go off, there's an awful lot of dead leaders in one place. And so what we always do in this case is one of the members of the President's cabinet, somebody who is eligible to be president, meaning natural-born citizen, resident for 14 years, 35 years old, one person will be left behind, put into a hotel room somewhere, guarded by the Secret Service, and they make sure that person is safe. So if something does happen, that person becomes president. Now you might be thinking, oh my gosh, that would be a horrible situation. What do we do in that situation? So they become president. So what? Well, you've got to realize that a lot of other things can take effect very, very quickly. So for instance, all those members of the House of Representatives and Senate, they will simply be appointed, reappointed by the governors of each state. Within a matter of a week or so, all the members of the House, all the members of the Senate can be reassembled and put back into place. New members appointed. What happens if you're appointed? Well, the next time there's an election, you have to run for re-election, just like you were in office to begin with. Then all of a sudden, this new president will turn around and appoint a new vice president. And the new vice president will be approved by the Senate before becoming vice president. At the same time, the Senate will select a president pro tem, and the House will select the new Speaker of the House, and we're all put back together. How long will it take? Well, we've never had to do it, but there's good estimates that it should be no more than about a week or two before we could reassemble the government and have everything running back the way it was before. The President must also commission or promote all officers in the U.S. military. Now, if you're obviously getting promoted from something very low to something like captain, you're going to get a letter. You're not going to get a personal invite to the White House. But if you're getting promoted to general, 4-star, 5-star general, you're going to get invited to the White House, and you're going to be told that you can, in fact, you'll be, in fact, awarded with the stars. They'll be pinned right on you, and at the same time, there'll be a short little speech made about you. So how does the president get elected? Well, first, let's talk about the whole idea that there are basically two political parties in the country. And so when we talk about presidential politics, we're talking about basically these two political parties. What's important to realize, there are other political parties, but those political parties do not play a significant role because there's not a large number of people in the country that belong to those other political parties. Most people belong to either the Democrat or Republican Party. The process begins typically as people begin to choose to run for president. And this usually happens in the year to year and a half before the actual election. And then in January through June of election year, so 2016 coming up is an election year, we already have some people that have announced, but in January through June of the election year, this is when things begin to become very, very excited and people get very, very active. This is what we call the primary election time, the preliminary race to see among all the Democrats running for president and all the Republicans running for president, which two people, one Republican, one Democrat, will represent each party in the November election. That November election is referred to as a general election, meaning it's the final election. It's sort of like the finals, whereas the preliminary or the primary are sort of like the semifinals in a sense. All national elections take place on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. This is not on the screen, it's written in yellow. It's not made up. This is very explicit in the Constitution, so there's no doubt when our elections will be held. And of course, that happens every 4 years for president. Now, when we count votes, what's important to realize is counting votes happens in a very precise way. States are able to make, however, some decisions about any kind of changes that they might make when they actually hold their elections in their states, because elections happen in states. They don't happen in the country. What that means is each state is responsible for counting the votes in its state and reporting that to the Congress for the purposes of deciding who's president. So there's a couple of terms here we need to learn. First of all, we have this thing called the popular vote. Popular comes from the whole idea of people. So we have the idea of population here. So a popular vote is a people vote. It is the vote of all the people that are voting, a total number of people that vote one way versus another. That would be a popular vote. We don't use the popular vote to decide who becomes president. Absolutely. There's a little bit of a nuance here that's important to recognize. So the next thing we need to understand is, what do we mean by electoral votes? The total number of electoral votes, okay, is equal to the total number of people in the House of Representatives and, of course, the total number of people in the Senate, plus 3 for Washington, D.C. So in the House, we have a total of 435 people. In the Senate, there's a total of 100 people. That's 535 plus the 3. We end up with 538 electoral votes. Now, that's the total number of electoral votes for the entire country. The number of electoral votes for a state, however, is the number of people that it has in the House of Representatives and, of course, its 2 senators. So in California, for instance, there are 53 people in the House of Representatives, plus the 2 senators, for a total of 55 electoral votes. The person who gets the most popular votes in a state gets all the electoral votes in the state. This is the idea of the sort of a winner-takes-all kind of situation. So again, as we count all the votes in California, the person who gets the most votes in California, the popular vote, that person gets not the popular vote, they get the electoral votes for that state. They would get all 55 electoral votes. The minimum number of electoral votes that a state has, of course, is going to be equal to the minimum number of people that a state can have in the House and the Senate, which is 3. The candidate that gets a simple majority of those electoral votes is going to be declared the winner. Now, 535, 50% of that, plus 1 vote. Do the math. 535, 50% of that, or half of that, plus 1 vote. The answer is this. You need to get 270 electoral votes in order to win. If you get 270 electoral votes, nobody else can get 270 electoral votes. And the result is you are President of the United States. It's important to note, in our early history, presidents and vice presidents ran separately. However, for the last 110, 115 years, what has happened is presidents and vice presidents have run together as a ticket. They've run in a sense that when you vote for president, you automatically get a certain person for vice president. You don't vote separately for a vice president. The inauguration, which is the swearing-in ceremony for the president, is always done on January 20th at noon. It's a very precise time. The former president, the president that is the outgoing president, if there is one, shows up at the ceremony and is there to watch the new president get sworn in. At the moment that the new president says, "So help me God," at that moment, he is the president, and the former president isn't the president anymore. The president will then turn around, the new president will turn around and give what's called an inaugural address, a speech at his inauguration, which basically outlines his plans for what he expects in his first term to accomplish, the things that he wants to focus on. Well, what if nobody gets 270 electoral votes? And you're thinking, well, that's not possible. I mean, there's 2 candidates, someone's going to get 270. No, what if there are 3 or 4 candidates? And what if every one of them gets a few electoral votes? It's quite possible nobody could get 270. Well, there's actually a system for this as well. Well, this is always a consideration. Matter of fact, there have been several times in our history where that's exactly happened, where nobody wins. And the result is, well, how do we decide? The Constitution says the House of Representatives will select the president. Now, some people say that, well, they'll select the president from those who are running for president, from those who have the most electoral votes, except there's no specification for that. It's more of an assumption or a tradition. But the reality is, they could pick whoever they want. They could pick somebody who wasn't even running, for that matter, as long as they're qualified to be president. The Senate will then turn around and select the vice president. This is what the electoral map looks like, and you can see that each of the states is given a certain number of electoral votes. So you look at something like Montana, and you'll notice Montana has 3, which means they have 1 representative and 2 senators, and that's the number of electoral votes. Notice that no state has less than 3. We're going to look at a few maps here, and I'm going to briefly say some things about these maps. These are election maps from 2008 and 2012. In 2008, Barack Obama won pretty handedly against John McCain, and you can look at the map and see the states which are in red that McCain won versus those that are in blue which Barack Obama won. And it looks like John McCain, looks like a pretty close election based upon the number of states. But you got to remember that those states aren't equal in terms of their electoral votes. And so just because they're a large state, they may have a very small population. Consider Montana, for instance, a very large state with a very low population. But at the same time, it does look like that this was a rather close election. When you break this down even further, it looks even closer. So here's the way that we account, actually, the votes in every state. Every single county in every state counts its own votes. And then every county reports those votes to the Secretary of State for the state. So there is a Secretary of State even in the state of California. So Orange County, which is down here at the bottom of the map, Orange County is going to send its votes, its information, all the way up to San Jose for the purpose, Sacramento, for the purposes of counting the votes. And when all the counties have reported, then it's determined who has the most popular vote for the state, and therefore who's going to get the electoral votes. Well, when you look at the map and you break the map down by county, so you take the entire map of the United States and turn it into a giant map of the counties of the United States, what you notice is that overwhelmingly the number of counties that supported John McCain was beyond those that supported Barack Obama. And you're wondering, well, how in fact did Obama win if more counties supported John McCain? We've got to remember something. It's based on population again, not just simply based on the numbers of counties or numbers of states. And so when you look at this map, what you're going to notice is that those places which are heavily populated, places like New York City, places like Boston, places like, for instance, up here in Philadelphia, places like down here in Miami, places like over here in Chicago, places like San Francisco, places like Los Angeles. These are places, Seattle. These are places that are very densely populated. And if they swing towards one candidate or the other, the result is the candidate will pick up enough votes just by winning those places, just by winning those states. And there's those cities. And there's other cities, by the way, that we could add to this. But if you just win those, the result is that you end up with enough votes in that state to swing that state in your favor. This is an important idea, so keep your mind on this for a moment here. This is what the 2012 election map looks like, and you'll notice here that, again, it looks very, very close. Barack Obama wins rather handedly, 332 electoral votes to 206. The popular vote was closer here. It's about 5 million votes. But when you turn this into a county map, what you notice is overwhelmingly, it looks here like Mitt Romney may have won the election. But again, why did it go towards Obama? Because of those heavily populated areas. Now, I bring all this up for a simple reason. Here's the big idea, and the last idea. In the electoral process, it's important to remember that the electoral process is based on the same process by which we decided that each state should be fairly representative in the U.S. Congress. So during the Constitutional Convention, when the members of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were voting and deciding on how things were going to be organized in the Constitution, one of the things that they decided was, in the Great Compromise, that for every state to be fairly, equally, in a balanced way treated or given authority in the House of Representatives, what they needed to do was they needed to make sure that every state was considered based upon both population and, of course, 2 votes per state. We take that same system and we apply it now to the electoral process. We want to make sure that every state matters when it comes to the election of president, not just the states with large numbers of people. Because quite honestly, if it was only about large numbers of people, looking at this map, you'd only have to win about 3 or 4 states in order to become president of the United States. You win California and Texas, New York and Florida and maybe Illinois or Ohio, and you're president. If we were counting popular vote, there's enough people there and enough votes there, you could probably become president of the United States. But if we want the president to represent the whole country, to represent a wider variety of people and a wider variety of places, in the middle of the country where there's lots of farmers, and on the coast where there's lots of city dwellers, and in the north where there's people that are, of one flavor or kind versus those in the south that might have different attitudes and feelings about things. We want the president to represent everybody, not just people that live in big cities, in big states on the coasts. Well, in order to make sure that happens, we got to make sure that a president visits many states as possible. And we got to make sure that that president wins some of those states in order to become president. And so what we do is we make sure of that by using this electoral system. That when the president gets elected, that president represents a large number of people over a large number of states. In a variety of states. We don't just count the popular vote because, quite honestly, if we just counted the popular vote, it would be a referendum, a decision made by people that live in very large cities and large states. And it would leave most of the, as you saw on that map of all the counties, it would leave most of the center part of the country sort of unrepresented by the president. Unrepresented. Going back to the revolution, one of the major complaints we always had was that we did not want to have, taxation without representation. Taxation or government decisions without a say in what was going on. And if we had an election where we did not use electoral votes, the result would be we could literally have a situation where the people of the center part of the country, a large number of people, would feel as if they had no voice in Washington, D.C. when it came to the president. No relationship, no connection to that person. And perhaps even feeling that that person had no care, concern, or thought for them. And that would be a very sad situation in this country.